Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of The Reading Corner with MooseChangerPat. That's me, in case you're wondering. Today, we are reading Chapter 10 of Queen of Sorcery. And as always, you should support the original work by buying the original book by David Eddings. Chapter 10. The city of the Membrate Eddings reared almost like a mountain beside the sparkling river. Its thick, high walls were surmounted by massive battlements and great towers, and slender spires with bright banners at their tips rose within the walls, gleaming golden in the afternoon sun. "Behold, Vomimber," Mandorlin proclaimed with pride. "Queen of cities! Upon that rock the tide of Angarak crushed and recoiled and crashed again. Upon this field met their ruin. The soul and pride of Erendia doth reside within that fortress, and the power of the Dark One may not prevail against it." "We've been here before, Mandorlin," Mr. Wolf said sourly. "Don't be impolite, father," Aunt Paul told the old man. Then she turned to Mandorlin, and to Garion's amazement, she spoke in an idiom he had never heard from her lips before. "Wilt thou, Sir Knight, convey us presently into the palace of thy king? We must needs take counsel with him in matters of gravest urgency." She delivered this without the least trace of self-consciousness, as if the archaic formality came quite naturally to her. "Forasmuch as thou art the mightiest knight on life, we place ourselves under the protection of thy arm." Mandorlin, after a startled instant, slid with a crash from his war-horse and sank to his knees before her. "My Lady Polgara," he replied in a voice throbbing with respect and reverence even, "I accept thy charge and will convey thee safely into King Coradolin. Should any man question thy paramount right to the king's attention, I shall prove his folly upon his body." Aunt Paul smiled at him encouragingly, and he vaulted into the saddle with a clang, and led the way at a roiling trot, his whole bearing seething with a willingness to do battle. "What was that about?" Wolf asked. "Mandorlin needed something to take his mind off his troubles," she replied. "He's been out of sorts for the last few days." As they drew closer to the city, Garion could see the scars on the great walls where heavy stones from the Angarak catapults had struck the unyielding rock. The battlements high above were chipped and pitted from the impact of showers of steel-tipped arrows. The stone archway that led into the city revealed the incredible thickness of the walls, and the iron-bound gate was massive. They clattered through the archway and into the narrow, crooked streets. The people they passed seemed, for the most part, to be commoners, who quickly moved aside. The faces of the men in dun-colored tunics and the women in patched dresses were dull and uncurious. "They don't seem very interested in us," Garion commented quietly to Dernick. "I don't think the ordinary people and the gentry pay much attention to each other here," Dernick replied. "They live side by side, but they don't know anything about each other. Maybe that's what's wrong with Erendia." Gary nodded soberly. Although the commoners were indifferent, the nobles at the palace seemed afire with curiosity. Word of the party's entrance into the city apparently had raced ahead of them through the narrow streets, and the windows and parapets of the palace were alive with people in brightly colored clothes. "Abate thy pace, Sir Knight," a tall man with dark hair and beard, wearing a black velvet surcoat and his polished mail, called down from the parapet to Mandorlin as they clattered into the broad plaza before the palace. "Lift thy visor so that I might know thee." Mandorlin stopped in amazement before the closed gate and raised his visor. "What discourtesy is this?" he demanded. "I am, as all the world knows, Mandorlin, Baron of Vomandor. Surely thou canst see my crest upon the face of my shield." "Any man may wear another's crest," the man above declared disdainfully. Mandorlin's face darkened. "Art thou not mindful that no man on life would dare to counterfeit my semblance?" he asked in a dangerous tone. Sir Anderig, another knight on the parapet told the dark-haired man, this is indeed Sir Mandorlin. I met him on the field of the Great Tourney last year, and our meeting cost me a broken shoulder and put a ringing in my ears which have not yet subsided. Ah, Sir Anderig replied, since thou wilt vouch for him, Sir Helbergin, I will admit that this is indeed the bastard of Vomandor. You're going to have to do something about that one of these days, Berg said quietly to Mandorlin. It would seem so, Mandorlin replied. Who, however, are these others with thee who seek admittance, Sir Knight? Anderig demanded. I will not cause the gates to open for foreign strangers. Mandorlin straightened in his saddle. Behold, he announced in a voice that could possibly be heard all over the city. I bring you honor beyond measure. Fling wide the palace gate and prepare one and all to make obedience. You may look upon the holy face of Belgarath the sorcerer, the eternal man, and upon the divine countenance of his daughter, the Lady Pulgera, who have come to remember to consult with the King of Arendia on diverse matters. Isn't that a little overdone? Garen whispered to Aunt Paul. It's customary, dear, she replied placidly. When you're dealing with errands, you have to be a little extravagant to get their attention. And who hath told thee that this is Lord Belgarath? Anderig asked with the faintest hint of a sneer. I will bend no knee before an unproved vagabond. Dost thou question my words, Sir Knight? Mandorlin returned in an ominously quiet voice. And wilt thou then come down and put thy doubt to the test? Or is it perhaps that thou would prefer to cringe dog-like behind thy parapet and yap at thy betters? Oh, that's very good, Berg said admiringly. Mandorlin grinned tightly at the big man. I don't think we're getting anywhere with this, Mr. Wolf muttered. It looks like I'll have to prove something to this skeptic if we're ever going to get in to see Corydolin. He slid down from his saddle and thoughtfully removed a twig from his horse's tail, picked up somewhere during their journey. Then he strode to the center of the plaza and stood there in his gleaming white robe. Sir Knight, he called up mildly to Anderig, you're a cautious man, I see. That's a good quality, but it can be carried too far. I am hardly a child, old man, the dark-haired knight replied in a tone hovering on the verge of insult, and I believe only what my own eye hath confirmed. It must be a sad thing to believe so little, Wolf observed. He bent then, and inserted the twig he'd been holding between two of the broad granite flagstones at his feet. He stepped back a pace and stretched his hand out above the twig, his face curiously gentle. I'm going to do you a favor, Sir Anderig, he announced. I'm going to restore your faith. Watch closely. And then he spoke a single soft word that Garen couldn't quite hear, but which set off a now familiar surge and a faint roaring sound. At first, nothing seemed to happen. Then the two flagstones began to buckle upward with a grinding sound as the twig grew visibly thicker and began to reach up toward Mr. Wolf's outstretched hand. There were gasps from the palace walls as branches began to sprout from the twig as it grew. Wolf raised his hand higher, and the twig obediently grew at his gesture, its branches broadening. By now it was a young tree and still growing. One of the flagstones cracked with a sharp report. There was absolute silence as every eye fixed an odd fascination on the tree. Mr. Wolf held out both hands and turned them till the palms were up. He spoke again, and the tips of the branches swelled and began to bud. Then the tree burst into flower, its blossoms a delicate pink and white. Apple, wouldn't you say, Paul? Wolf asked over his shoulder. It appears to be, father, she replied. He patted the tree fondly and then turned back to the dark-haired knight who had sunk, white-faced and trembling to his knee. Well, Sir Anderig, he inquired, what do you believe now? Please forgive me, holy Belgarath, Andred begged in a strangled voice. Mr. Wolf drew himself up and spoke sternly, his words slipping into the measured cadences of the membrane idiom as easily as Aunt Paul had earlier. I charge thee, Sir Knight, to care for this tree. It hath grown here to renew thy faith and trust. Thy debt to it must be paid with tender and loving attention to its needs. In time it will bear fruit, and thou wilt gather the fruit and give it freely to any who ask it of thee. For thy soul's sake thou wilt refuse none, no matter how humble. As the tree gives freely, so shalt thou. That's a nice touch, Aunt Paul approved. Wolf winked at her. I will do even as thou hast commanded me, holy Belgarath, Sir Endering choked. I pledge my heart to it. Mr. Wolf returned to his horse. At least he'll do one useful thing in his life, he muttered. After that, there was no further discussion. The palace gate creaked open, and they all rode into the inner courtyard and dismounted. Mandorlin led them past kneeling and even sobbing nobles who reached out to touch Mr. Wolf's robe as he passed. At Mandorlin's heels, they walked through the broad, tapestried hallways with a growing throng behind them. The door to the throne room opened, and they entered. The Erendish throne room was a great vaulted hall with sculptured buttresses soaring upward along the walls. Tall, narrow windows rose between the buttresses, and the light streaming through the stained glass panels were jeweled. The floor was polished marble, and on the carpeted stone platform at the far end stood the double thrones of Erendia, backed by heavy purple drapes. Flanking the draped wall hung the massive antique weapons of 20 generations of Erendish royalty. Lances, maces, and huge swords, taller than any man, hung among the tattered war banners of forgotten kings. Corydolin of Erendia was a sickly-looking young man in a gold-embroidered purple robe, and he wore his large gold crown as if it were too heavy for him. Beside him, on the double throne, sat his pale, beautiful queen. Together they watched somewhat apprehensively as the throng surrounding Mr. Wolf approached the wide steps leading up to the throne. "My king," Mandorlin announced, dropping to one knee, "I bring into thy presence holy Belgarath, disciple of Alder, and the staff upon which the kingdoms of the West have leaned since time began." "He knows who I am, Mandorlin," Mr. Wolf said. He stepped forward and bowed briefly. "Hail, Corydolin and Meazarana," he greeted the king and queen. "I'm sorry we hadn't had the chance to get acquainted before." "The honor is ours, noble Belgarath," the young king replied in a voice whose rich timbre belied his frail appearance. "My father spoke often of thee," the queen said. "We were good friends," Wolf told her. "Allow me to present my daughter, Bulgara." "Great lady," the king responded with a respectful inclination of his head. "All the world knows of thy power, but men have forgotten to speak of thy beauty." "We'll get along well together," Aunt Paul answered warmly, smiling at him. "My heart trembles at the sight of the flower of all womanhood," the queen declared. Aunt Paul looked at the queen thoughtfully. "We must talk, Meazarana," she said in a serious tone, "in private, and very soon." The queen looked startled. Mr. Wolf introduced the rest of them, and each bowed in turn to the young king. "Welcome, gentles all," Corydolin said. "My poor court is overwhelmed by so noble a company." "We don't have much time, Corydolin," Mr. Wolf told him. "The courtesy of the Erendish throne is the marvel of the world. I don't want to offend you and your lovely queen by cutting short those stately observances which so ornament your court, but I have certain news which I have to present to you in private. The matter is of extreme urgency." Then I am at thy immediate disposal," the king replied, raising from his throne. "Forgive us, dear friends," he said to the assembled nobles, "but this ancient friend of our kingly line hath information which must be imparted to our ears alone with utmost urgency. I pray thee, let us go apart for a little space of time to receive this instruction. We shall return presently. Olgara, Mr. Wolf said. Go ahead, father, she replied. Just now I have to speak with Maya Zarana about something that's very important to her. Can't it wait? No, father, it can't. And with that, she took the queen's arm and the two left. Mr. Wolf stared after her for a moment, then he shrugged, and he and Cora Dolan also left the throne room. An almost shocked silence followed their departure. Most unseemly, an old courtier with wispy white hair disapproved. Unnecessary haste, my lord, Van Dorlin informed him. As the revered Belgrath hath intimated, our mission is the hinge-pin of the survival of all the kingdoms of the West. Our ancient foe may soon be abroad again. It will not be long, I fear, ere Membrate Knights will again stand the brunt of a titanic war. Blessed then be the tongue which brings the news, the white-haired old man declared. I had feared that I had seen my last battle and would die abed in my dotage. I thank great Chalden that I shall have my vigor, and that my prowess is undiminished by the passage of a mere 80 years. Garion drew off by himself to one side of the room to wrestle with a problem. Events had swept him into the King Cor Dolan's court before he had time to prepare himself for an unpleasant duty. He had given his word to Leldarin to bring certain things to the king's attention, but he did not have the faintest idea how to begin. The exaggerated formality of the Arendish court intimidated him. This was not at all like the rough, good-natured court of King Enheg and Val Alorn, or the almost homey court of King Furlak and Sendar. This was Vomimber, and the prospect of blurting out news of the wild scheme of a group of Asturian firebrands, as he blurted out the news of the Earl of Jarvik and Cherrick, now seemed utterly out of the question. Suddenly, the thought of that previous event struck him forcibly. The situation, then, was so similar to this one that it seemed all at once like some elaborate game. The moves on the board were almost identical, and in each case he had been placed in the uncomfortable position of being required to block that last crucial move where a king would die and a kingdom would collapse. He felt oddly powerless, as if his entire life were in the fingers of two faceless players maneuvering pieces in the same patterns on some vast board in a game that, for all he knew, had lasted for eternity. There was no question about what he had to be done. The players, however, seemed content to leave it up to him to come up with a way to do it. King Coridolan appeared shaken when he returned to the throne room with Mr. Wolf a half-hour later, and he controlled his expression with obvious difficulty. "Forgive me, gentles all," he apologized, "but I had disturbing news. For the present time, however, let us put aside our cares and celebrate this historic visit. Summon musicians, and command that a banquet be made ready." There was a stir near the door, and a black-robed man entered with a half-dozen Membrate knights in full armor following him closely, their eyes narrow with suspicion and their hands on their sword hilts as if daring anyone to bar their leader's path. As the robed man strode nearer, Garion saw his angular eyes and scarred cheeks. The man was a Mergo. Beric put a firm hand on Hedder's arm. The Mergo had obviously dressed in haste, and he seemed slightly breathless from his hurried trip to the throne room. "Your Majesty?" he rasped, bowing deeply to Coridolan. "I have been advised that visitors have arrived at thy court, and have made haste here to greet them in the name of my king Tar Urgas." Coridolan's face grew cold. "I do not recall summoning thee, Nachak," he said. "It is, then, as I had feared," the Mergo replied. "These messengers have spoken ill of my race, seeking to dissever the friendship which doth exist between the thrones of Arendia and of Cathal Mergos. I am chagrined to find that thou hast given ear to slanders without offering the opportunity to reply. Is this just, august majesty? Who is this? Mr. Wolf asked Corridolin. Notchak, the king replied, the ambassador of Cathal Mergos. Shall I introduce thee to him, ancient one? That won't be necessary, Mr. Wolf answered bleakly. Every Mergo alive knows who I am. Mothers in Cathal Mergos frighten their children into obedience by mentioning my name. But I am not a child, old man, Notchak sneered. I'm not afraid of you. That could be a serious failing, Silk observed. The Mergo's name had struck Garion almost like a blow, and he looked at the scarred face of the man who had so misled Leldarin and his friends. He realized that the players had once again moved their pieces into that last crucial position, and that who would win and who would lose once again depended entirely on him. What lies have they told the king? Notchak was demanding of Mr. Wolf. No lies, Notchak, Wolf told him, just the truth. That should be enough. I protest, your majesty, Notchak appealed to the king. I protest in the strongest manner possible. All the world knows of his hatred for my people. How can you allow him to poison your mind against us? He forgot the these and thous this time, Silk commented slyly. He's excited, Beric replied. Mergos get clumsy when they're excited. It's one of their shortcomings. Alloins, Notchak spat. That's right, Mergo, Beric said coldly. He was still holding Hedder's arm. Notchak looked at them, and then his eyes widened as he seemed to see Hedder for the first time. He recoiled from the Algar's hate-filled stare, and his half-dozen knights closed protectively around him. Your Majesty, he rasped. I know that man to be Hedder of Algaria, a known murderer. I demand that you arrest him. Demand? Notchak? The king asked with a dangerous glint in his eyes. Thou wilt present demands to me in my own court? Forgive me, your majesty, Notchak apologized quickly. The sight of that animal so disturbed me that I forgot myself. You'd be wise to leave now, Notchak, Mr. Wolf recommended. It's not really a good idea for a Mergo to be alone in the presence of so many Alorns. Accidents have a way of happening under such conditions. Grandfather, Garion said urgently, without knowing exactly why. He knew that it was time to speak. Notchak must not be allowed to leave the throne room. The faithless players had made their final moves, and the game must end here. Grandfather, he repeated, there's something I have to tell you. Not now, Garion. Wolf was still looking with hard eyes at the Mergo. It's important, Grandfather. Very important. Mr. Wolf turned as if to reply sharply, but then he seemed to see something that no one else in the throne room could see, and his eyes widened in momentary amazement. All right, Garion, he said in a strangely quiet voice. Go ahead. Some men are planning to kill the king of Erendia. Notchak's one of them. Garion had said it louder than he'd intended, and a sudden silence fell over the throne room at his words. Notchak's face went pale, and his hand moved involuntarily towards his sword hilt, then froze. Garion was suddenly keenly aware of Beric hulking just behind him, and Hedar, grim as death in black leather, towering beside him. Notchak stepped back and made a quick gesture to his steel-clad knights. Quickly, they formed a protective ring around him, their hands on their weapons. I won't stay and listen to such slander, the Mergo declared. I have not yet given thee my permission to withdraw, Notchak, Corridolin informed him coolly. I require thy presence yet a while. The young king's face was stern, and his eyes bored into the Mergos. Then he turned to Garion. I would hear more of this. Speak truthfully, lad, and fear not reprisal from any man for thy words. Garion drew a deep breath and spoke carefully. I don't really know all the details, your majesty, he explained. I found out about it by accident. Say what thou canst, the king told him. As nearly as I can tell, your majesty, next summer when you travel to Voestur, a group of men are going to try to kill you somewhere on the highway. Asturian traitors, doubtless, a gray-haired courtier suggested. They call themselves patriots, Garion answered. Inevitably, the courtier sneered. Such attempts are not uncommon, the king stated. We will take steps to guard against them. I thank thee for this information. There's more, your majesty, Garen added. When they attack, they're going to be wearing the uniforms of Talnidran legionnaires. Silk whistled sharply. The whole idea is to make your nobles believe that you've been killed by the Talnidrans, Garen continued. These men are sure that Mimber will immediately declare war on the Empire, and that as soon as that happens, the legions will march in. Then, when everybody here is involved in the war, they're going to announce that Asturia is no longer subject to the Arendish throne. They're sure that the rest of Asturia will follow them at that point. I see, the king replied thoughtfully. 'Tis a well-conceived plan, but with a subtlety uncharacteristic of our wild-eye Asturian brothers. But I have yet heard nothing linking the emissary of Tar Urgas with this treason. The whole plan was his, your majesty. He gave them all the details and the gold to buy the Talnidran uniforms, and to encourage other people to join them. He lies! Nachak burst out. Thou shalt have opportunity to reply, Nachak, the king advised him. He turned back to Garion. Let us pursue this matter further. How canst thou buy this knowledge? I can't say, your majesty, Garion replied painfully. I gave my word not to. One of the men told me about it to prove that he was my friend. He put his life in my hands to show how much he trusted me. I can't betray him. Thy loyalty speaks well of thee, young Garion, the king commended him, but thy accusation against the Mergo ambassador is most grave. Without violating thy trust, canst thou prove corroboration? Helplessly, Garion shook his head. This is a serious matter, your majesty, Nachak declared. I am the personal representative of Tar Urgas. This lying urchin is Belgarath's creature, and his wild, unsubstantial story is an obvious attempt to discredit me and to drive a wedge between the thrones of Arendi and Cathal Mergos. This accusation must not be allowed to stand. The boy must be forced to identify these imaginary plotters, or to admit that he lies. He hath given his pledge, Nachak, the king pointed out. He says so, your majesty, Nachak replied with a sneer. Let us put him to the test. An hour on the rack may persuade him to speak freely. I've seldom had much faith in confessions obtained by torment, Dolan said. If it pleases your majesty, Mandorlin interjected, it may be that I can help to resolve this matter. Garion threw a stricken look at the knight. Mandorlin knew Leldarin, and it would be a simple thing for him to guess the truth. Mandorlin, moreover, was a Mimbrate, and Coradolan was his king. Not only was he under no compulsion to remain silent, but his duty almost obliged him to speak. Sir Mandorlin, the king responded gravely, thy devotion to truth and duty are legendary. Canst thou, perchance, identify these plotters? The question hung there. Nay, sire, Mandorlin replied firmly, but I know Garion to be a truthful and honest boy. I will vouch for him. That's scanty corroboration, Nachak asserted. I declare that he lies, so where does that leave us? The lad is my companion, Mandorlin said. I will not be the instrument of breaking his pledge, since his honor is as dear to me as mine own. But our law, however, a cause incapable of proof may be decided by trial at arms. I will champion this boy. I declare before this company that this Nachak is a foul villain who hath joined with diverse others to slay my king. He pulled off his steel gauntlet and tossed it to the floor. The crash as it struck the polished stones seemed thunderous. "Take up my gage, Mergo," Mandorlin said coldly. "Or let one of thy sycophant knights take it up for thee. I will prove thy villainy upon thy body or upon the body of thy champion." Natchak stared first at the mailed gauntlet, and then at the great knight standing accusingly before him. He licked his lips nervously and looked around the throne room. Except for Mandorlin, none of the Mimbrate nobles present were under arms. The Mergo's eyes narrowed with a sudden desperation. "Kill him!" he snarled at the 6 men in armor surrounding him. The knights looked shocked, doubtful. "Kill him!" Natchak commanded them. 1,000 gold pieces to the man who spills out his life! The faces of the 6 knights went flat at his words. As one man, they drew their swords and spread out, moving with raised shields toward Mandorlin. There were gasps and cries of alarm as the nobles and their ladies scrambled out of the way. "What treason is this?" Mandorlin demanded of them. "Are ye so enamored of this Mergo and his gold that ye will draw weapons in the king's presence in open defiance of the law's prohibitions? Put up your swords!" But they ignored his words and continued their grim advance. "Defend thyself, Sir Mandorlin," Horadolin urged, half rising from his throne. "I free thee of the law's constraint." Beric, however, had already begun to move, noting that Mandorlin had not carried his shield into the throne room. The red-bearded man jerked an enormous 2-handed broadsword down from the array of banners and weapons at one side of the dais. "Mandorlin!" he shouted, and with a great heave he slid the huge blade, skittering and bouncing across the stone floor toward the knight's feet. Mandorlin stopped the sliding weapon with one mailed foot, stooped, and picked it up. The approaching knights looked a bit less confident as Mandorlin lifted the 6-foot blade with both hands. Beric, grinning hugely, drew his sword from one hip and his war axe from the other. Heder, his drawn saber held low, was circling the clumsy knights on cat-like feet. Without thinking, Garen reached for his own sword, but Mr. Wolf's hand closed on his wrist. "You stay out of this," the old man told him, and pulled him clear of the impending fight. Mandorlin's first blow crashed against a quickly raised shield, shattering the arm of a knight with a crimson surcoat over his armor and hurling him into a clattering heap 10 feet away. Beric parried a sword stroke from a burly knight with his axe and battered at the man's raised shield with his own heavy sword. Hedar toyed expertly with a knight in green enameled armor, easily avoiding his opponent's awkward strokes and flicking the point of his saber at the man's visored face. The steely ring of sword on sword echoed through Coradolin's throne room, and showers of sparks cascaded from the clash of edge against edge. With huge blows, Mandorlin smashed at a second man. A vast sweep of his 2-handed sword went under the knight's shield, and the man shrieked as the great blade bit through his armor and into his side. Then he fell with blood spouting from the sheared-in gash that reached halfway through his body. Beric, with a deft backswing of his war axe, caved in the side of the burly knight's helmet, and the knight half spun and fell to the floor. Heder feinted a quick move, then drew his saber point through a slot in the green armored knight's visor. The stricken knight stiffened as the saber ran into his brain. As the melee surged across the polished floor, the nobles and ladies scurried this way and that to avoid being overrun by the struggling men. Natchak watched with dismay as his knights were systematically destroyed before his eyes. Then quite suddenly he turned and fled. "He's getting away!" Garion shouted, but Heder was already in pursuit, his dreadful face and blood-smeared saber melting the courtiers and their screaming ladies out of his path as he ran to cut off Natchak's flight. The Mergo had almost reached the far end of the hall before Heddar's long strides carried him through the crowd to block the doorway. With a cry of despair, the ambassador yanked his sword from his scabbard, and Garen felt a strange momentary pity for him. As the Mergo raised his sword, Heddar flicked his saber almost like a whip, lashing him once on each shoulder. Natchak desperately tried to raise his numbed arms to protect his head, but Heddar's blade dropped low instead. Then, with a peculiar fluid grace, the grim-faced Algar quite deliberately ran the Mergo through. Garion saw the saber blade coming out between Natchak's shoulders, angling sharply upward. The ambassador gasped, dropped his sword, and gripped Heddar's wrist with both hands. But the hawk-faced man inexorably turned his hand, twisting the sharp curved blade inside the Mergo's body. Natchak groaned and shuddered horribly. Then his hand slipped off Heddar's wrist and his legs buckled under him. With a gurgling sigh, he toppled backwards, sliding limply off of Heddar's blade.